Elena Vance stood alone near the marble columns of the Metropolitan Museum's Grand Hall. Gripping a champagne flute like it was the only thing tethering her to the ground. The Rothschild Foundation gala swirled around her. A glittering symphony of art collectors, philanthropists, and the kind of wealth that could restore a dozen Renaissance paintings without blinking. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light over designer gowns and black-tie tuxedos, and Elena had never felt more invisible. Her royal blue off-shoulder dress, borrowed from a former colleague who still pitied her, was elegant enough to pass inspection, but she knew the truth. She was an art restoration specialist drowning in debt and shame, who had scraped together the entry fee hoping to rebuild connections. Utterly unaware she was walking straight into a trap far more dangerous than professional humiliation. That's when she saw him. Across the crowded hall, Victor Kane stood beneath a towering Monet reproduction, devastating in an ivory-white dinner jacket, his arm draped possessively around a blonde socialite whose jewelry could fund Elena's rent for a year. He looked exactly as she remembered. Charming smile, calculating blue eyes, the kind of man who could convince you to hand over your life's work and thank him for the privilege. He'd stolen her research, destroyed her career at Columbia, and left her with a $180,000 debt she was still convinced she owed him, even though the paperwork had always felt wrong. For 2 years, Elena had perfected the art of becoming invisible, blending into gallery corners and museum crowds where no one would remember her face. But tonight, that carefully constructed armor shattered the instant Victor's eyes found hers across the room. His smile widened. He'd seen her, and he was walking her direction. Panic clawed up Elena's throat like a living thing. She couldn't face him. Not here. Not when she was still barely surviving, still gluing together the shattered pieces of the reputation he'd demolished. Her hands trembled so violently she nearly dropped her champagne. She turned sharply, weaving through clusters of guests, her breath coming too fast, too shallow, until she slipped through a side entrance into a smaller, dimly lit dining room where only a few lingering patrons sipped wine over flickering candles. Elena pressed her back against the cool wall, trying to remember the mantra her therapist had drilled into her. He has no power over you anymore. But her pulse hammered against her ribs, and she could still hear Victor's voice from their last encounter echoing in her skull. Who's going to believe you, Elena? You're nobody. I made you somebody, and I can unmake you just as easily. He destroyed you. The voice came from directly beside her, soft and cultured, carrying the faintest trace of Italian silk. Elena startled, her hand flying to her chest. An elegant woman with platinum silver blonde hair had materialized in the shadows like a phantom, seated at a corner table draped in burgundy velvet. She wore deep wine-colored fabric that seemed to drink the candlelight, and enough pearls to ransom a small museum collection. Her sharp blue-gray eyes studied Elena with an expression that blended sympathy with something far more calculating. The look of a chess player who just discovered the perfect piece. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to intrude, Elena stammered, pushing off the wall, her instinct screaming at her to run. Stay. The word was gentle but carried absolute authority, the kind of command that made kingdoms bend. You're running from the man in the white jacket. Victor Kane, yes. Elena's blood turned to ice. How do you? I make it my business to know everything about everyone who threatens what belongs to me. The woman's lips curved into a knowing smile that held decades of secrets. She gestured to the empty chair across from her with a hand heavy with vintage rings. Sit, Cora. You and I have something very important to discuss. Something that could save us both. Elena knew she should walk away, should run. But something in those calculating eyes held her captive. Not threat, but possibility. The possibility that for once, someone might help her fight back instead of watching her drown. She sat. The woman extended a manicured hand dripping with pearls and power. Maria Rossi. And before this night ends, I'm going to make you an offer that will change everything. Before Elena could respond, before she could process the weight of that name, Rossi, the family everyone whispered about in art circles, the ones who owned half the galleries in Manhattan. Maria's gaze shifted over Elena's shoulder, and genuine fear flickered across her aristocratic features. He's coming this way, Maria whispered, urgency cracking through her composed facade. Victor, he followed you. Elena's spine went rigid. She could feel him approaching like a cold front moving through the room, could sense the shift in air pressure that came with his presence. Maria's fingers closed around Elena's wrist beneath the table, her grip surprisingly strong for a woman draped in elegance. Listen carefully. I need you to trust me for exactly 30 seconds. Can you do that? Elena's heart slammed against her ribs. She glanced toward the dining room entrance and saw Victor's silhouette framed in golden light, scanning the room, hunting. What do you want from me?
Elena bratted.
Maria leaned in close, bringing the subtle scent of expensive perfume and desperation. Her words came in an urgent whisper that would alter the entire trajectory of Elena's life. Make him jealous. Pretend you belong to my son. Elena blinked, certain she'd misheard. I'm sorry, what? But Maria was already rising, pulling Elena to her feet with practiced grace. Her pearl bracelets sliding down her wrist as she linked their arms together like a mother guiding her daughter-in-law through a receiving line. There's a man across the room, Maria continued in a rapid whisper, her smile never faltering as she steered them through the candlelit tables. Tall, charcoal suit, tattoo on his neck. That's Dante, my son. In exactly 10 seconds, I'm going to introduce you as the woman who's stolen his heart, and you're going to smile at him like he's the only man in this museum. Do you understand? No, I don't understand any of this. Do you want Victor Kane to keep controlling your life? Maria's voice was suddenly steel wrapped in velvet. Or do you want to watch him burn? Elena's breath caught. She followed Maria's gaze and saw him then, the man Maria called her son. He stood near the back of the dining room, a glass of red wine in one hand, his other adjusting the cuff of an impeccably tailored charcoal suit. He was tall and powerfully built, with dark hair styled with precision and a distinctive neck tattoo that crept above his collar like a brand. His face was all sharp angles and controlled danger. Strong jaw shadowed with stubble, high cheekbones, and piercing dark eyes that tracked the room with the intensity of a man who missed nothing. Even from across the room, he radiated the kind of quiet, lethal authority that made her breath hitch. Unlike the smiling donors and chattering collectors, his expression remained unreadable, cold as winter stone, as he watched the crowd with the vigilance of someone who stood guard even at a charity gala. Elena barely knew the Rossi family beyond their reputation. Whispers of old money, art collections worth millions, and business dealings that no one discussed in polite company. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to slip away from whatever dangerous web she was being pulled into. She had enough problems of her own. The debt suffocating her, the destroyed career she was desperately trying to rebuild, the studio apartment in Queens she could barely afford. But Maria's hand trembled against her wrist despite the woman's composed exterior. And Victor Kane was 10 feet away, closing in with that predatory smile, the same smile he'd worn when he convinced her to sign documents she should have read, when he whispered promises about their future while systematically dismantling hers. Elena thought of the Columbia Lecture Hall where she'd once commanded a room of graduate students, thought of the authentication research Victor had published under his own name, thought of 2 years spent apologizing for existing while he thrived on her stolen work. She drew a breath, made her choice. All right, she whispered, her voice steadier than her racing heart. Tell me what to do. Welcome to Story Lens TV, where every story reveals something deeper. If you're ready to see what happens when Elena steps into Dante Rossi's dangerous world, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I love connecting with viewers from around the globe. Now let's see what Elena just agreed to. Maria's grip on Elena's arm tightened as she guided them across the dining room toward her son, who hadn't moved from his position near the back wall. As they approached, those dark eyes lifted from his wine glass and settled on Elena with an intensity that made her feel like every defense she'd ever built was being catalogued and assessed. He was even more striking up close, the kind of dangerous handsome that belonged in Renaissance paintings of fallen angels, all sharp edges and barely contained power beneath impeccable tailoring. Dante, Maria said, her voice carrying just enough warmth to sound genuine to anyone listening. I'd like you to meet Elena Vance. Elena, my son, Dante Rossi. Dante's gaze never left Elena's face as he extended his hand. Miss Vance. His voice was deep and controlled, carrying the weight of someone who chose every word with precision. When their hands connected, electricity shot up her arm, and she watched his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. He'd felt it too. Mr. Rossi, Elena managed. Surprised her voice didn't shake. We need to speak, Maria said quietly, glancing toward the entrance where Victor's silhouette still lurked. Privately. Now. Dante's expression didn't change, but something flickered in those dark eyes. Understanding, maybe, or calculation. He set down his wine glass and placed his hand at the small of Elena's back, the heat of his palm searing through the thin fabric of her dress. This way. He guided them through a staff corridor Elena hadn't noticed, past security who nodded at Dante with deference that spoke of either respect or fear, until they reached a small gallery closed for renovation. The moment the door shut behind them, Maria turned to her son. The Calvettis sent Lorenzo tonight. He's asking questions about Gianna, about why you haven't responded to their proposal. Dante's jaw turned to granite. I've made my position clear. Clear isn't enough, Maria countered, her composure cracking just enough to show the fear beneath. Lorenzo implied that silence is the same as insult. They're interpreting your lack of response as a declaration. We're running out of time before this becomes something neither of us can control. Then let it, Dante said coldly. I won't be sold like a prize horse to settle a 30-year-old grudge. They'll see it as war, Dante. You know what that means for our people, for the businesses, for... I know what it means. His voice was steel wrapped in ice. Elena stood frozen between them, finally understanding the weight of what she'd stumbled into. The Rossi family wasn't just wealthy art dealers. They were something far more dangerous, caught in the kind of power struggle that destroyed everything in its path. She should run, should walk out of this gallery and disappear into the crowd and never look back. What does this have to do with me? She heard herself ask instead. Maria turned to her with an expression that blended desperation and strategic calculation. The Calvettis want a marriage alliance because they believe it will give them leverage over our family's holdings. But if Dante is already seriously committed to someone else, someone outside their world, they can't claim insult. They'll have to back down without losing face. You want me to pretend to be his girlfriend? Elena said slowly, the pieces falling into place. For 4 months, Maria confirmed. Long enough to convince everyone, the Calvettis, Victor Kane, all of New York society, that the relationship is real. You'll attend events together, live in the same residence to maintain credibility, present yourselves as a couple genuinely in love. Elena's laugh came out sharp and bitter. And why would I agree to something this insane? Maria's eyes softened with something that might have been genuine sympathy. Because I know about the debt Victor claims you owe him. The $180,000 that's followed you like a shadow for 2 years. I have lawyers who can make it disappear, and I suspect when they investigate, they'll find it never legally existed in the first place. She paused, letting that sink in. I also know you were the brightest authentication specialist Columbia had seen in a decade before Victor Kane stole your research and destroyed your credibility. I have connections that can restore your reputation, get you access to collections you've only dreamed of studying. For months of your time in exchange for everything he took from you. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. Everything Maria was offering was exactly what she'd spent 2 years desperately wishing for. Freedom from the debt that suffocated her. A chance to work in her field again without Victor's theft hanging over her like a brand. But the cost felt impossibly high, stepping into a world of mafia politics and arranged marriages and the kind of danger that got people killed. She looked at Dante, who'd been silent through his mother's pitch, watching Elena with an unreadable expression. And what do you get out of this? She asked him directly. Freedom, he said simply. From expectations. From being treated like property in a negotiation I never agreed to. His eyes held hers. My mother is right that I need someone convincing enough to make the Calvettis back down. But I won't force you into this. If you say no, you walk out of here, and we never speak of it again. There was something in his voice, a thread of respect maybe or recognition of her autonomy, that made him different from Victor in a way she couldn't quite articulate. Victor had never given her real choices, only illusions of choice wrapped in manipulation. Dante was offering her a transaction with clear terms. No pretty lies about love or partnership, just honest need and honest payment. For months, she repeated. For months, Maria confirmed. At the end, you'll have legal documentation that the debt is fraudulent, connections to every major museum and private collection in North America, and enough money to start your own authentication firm if you choose. Elena thought of Victor's face when he saw her across the gala, thought of 2 years spent hiding and apologizing and believing she deserved nothing better. Thought of the research she'd poured her heart into, now published under his name while she scraped by on adjunct teaching positions that paid minimum wage. I have one condition, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Complete honesty. If you can't tell me something, say so. But don't lie to me. Not about the danger. Not about what I'm walking into. Not about anything. Dante studied her for a long moment, something that might have been surprise flickering across his features. Then he extended his hand. No lies. You have my word. She took his hand, sealing the agreement, and tried to ignore how right it felt when his fingers closed around hers. Then I'll do it. Maria's relief was visible, her shoulders dropping an inch from where they'd been locked with tension. Thank you, Cara. Truly. She glanced at her watch. Lorenzo Calvetti is still in the main gallery. We need to make this visible before the night ends. Dante nodded, his hand still holding Elena's. Then let's give them something to see. They returned to the gala as a unit, Maria leading, Elena's hand now firmly clasped in Dante's as he guided her through the crowd with the kind of possessive attention that made heads turn. Elena could feel eyes tracking them, could hear the whispers starting as people recognized Dante Rossi with an unknown woman on his arm. When they reached the main gallery where the auction was beginning, Dante steered her toward seats near the front, his arms sliding around her waist in a gesture that looked natural but felt like a brand. And there, 3 rows back, sat Victor Kane. His expression was carefully neutral, but Elena saw the moment he registered her presence. Saw the flash of shock, then possessive rage, then something colder and more calculating cross his face. His hand tightened on his date's arm hard enough to make the woman wince. Dante leaned in close, his breath warm against Elena's ear. His voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. The man staring daggers at us is Lorenzo Calvetti. Silver hair, black suit, 2 bodyguards flanking him. He's the one we need to convince. Elena glanced over and saw the man in question. Older, distinguished, with the kind of face that belonged on Roman coins and eyes that held no warmth whatsoever. He was watching them with open curiosity, his head tilted slightly as if trying to solve a puzzle. And Victor, Elena whispered back. Let him watch, Dante said, and there was something dark and satisfied in his tone. Let him see exactly what he lost. The auction began, and for the next hour, Elena and Dante played their roles flawlessly. He consulted her opinion on pieces with genuine interest, their heads bent close together in conversation that looked intimate from any angle. When a 15th-century sketch came up for bidding, Elena couldn't help herself. She launched into a quiet analysis of the brushwork and probable provenance that had Dante watching her with an intensity that felt entirely too real. You're brilliant, he said, and it didn't sound like part of the performance. By the time they left the museum, Elena's face hurt from maintaining a smile, and her nerves were strung tight as wire. Dante's driver brought the car around. A sleek black Maserati that probably cost more than her entire year's salary. And Dante held the door for her with the same careful attention he'd shown all evening. Once they were alone in the back seat, the performance dropped slightly, though Dante's driver could undoubtedly hear everything they said. You did well tonight, Dante said, loosening his tie with one hand. Lorenzo was convinced. I could see it. And Victor? Elena asked, unable to keep the tremor from her voice. Dante's expression went cold. Victor Kane can believe whatever he wants. He doesn't touch you again. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a vow. Tomorrow, Marco will pick you up at 9. Bring whatever matters to you. Everything else will replace. Replace. Elena's exhaustion was making her slow. "You're moving into my penthouse," Dante said matter-of-factly. "We can't maintain the illusion if we're living separately. People talk, staff gossip, and we need this to look real from every angle." Reality crashed over Elena in a wave that left her breathless. She'd agreed to 4 months of pretending, but she hadn't fully processed what that meant. Living with a stranger, inhabiting his space, letting him into every corner of her carefully controlled survival existence. "Hey!" Dante's voice softened slightly. "You can still walk away. We tear up the agreement, you go back to your life, and I figure something else out." But Elena thought of the debt, thought of Victor's smile tonight, thought of 2 years of invisible suffering.
No.
"I'm in. I just need a minute to adjust to the reality." Dante nodded, something like understanding in his eyes. "Fair enough." He pulled a business card from his wallet and handed it to her. "That's my private number. You need anything before tomorrow, questions, cold feet, anything you call. Day or night." The car pulled up to a modest building in Queens that Elena was embarrassed to have Dante see. But he walked her to the door anyway, his hand at her back, his eyes scanning the street with the vigilance of someone always expecting threats. At her apartment entrance, he paused.
Elena.
"What you did tonight took courage. I won't forget that." Then he was gone, back to the Maserati, leaving Elena alone with the realization that her life had just been completely upended by one whispered proposition and her own desperate need for justice. The next morning came too quickly. Elena packed her meager belongings. Clothes that fit in 2 suitcases, books she couldn't bear to leave, her mother's silver locket, the authentication tools she'd scraped together money to replace after Victor's betrayal. Everything she owned in the world fit in 3 bags, a stark reminder of how thoroughly he'd dismantled her life. Marco arrived exactly at 9. A kind-faced older man with silver threading through his dark hair and eyes that held the warmth his employer kept hidden. "Miss Vance," he greeted with genuine respect. "I'm Marco, Mr. Rossi's head of security. I'll be taking you home." Home. The word felt foreign. The drive to the Upper East Side was surreal, watching her cramped Queens neighborhood give way to tree-lined streets and buildings that cost more per square foot than most people earned in a year. When Marco pulled up to a historic brownstone overlooking Central Park, Elena had to physically keep her jaw from dropping. "Top 3 floors," Marco said with a small smile. "Mr. Rossi is at the office but asked me to give you the full tour." The penthouse was everything her studio wasn't. Space and light and minimalist elegance with hardwood floors that gleamed and floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the park like a living painting. The furniture was expensive but sparse, leather and dark wood and clean lines that felt masculine and controlled. No photographs, no personal items, nothing that revealed who Dante Rossi was beneath the tailored suits and calculated control. Marco showed her to a bedroom that was larger than her entire former apartment, decorated in soft grays and whites with an ensuite bathroom done in marble and a balcony that overlooked the morning light streaming through the park's trees. On the nightstand sat a crystal vase holding a single white rose and a note in strong, slanted handwriting. "For new beginnings." Something in Elena's chest tightened. It was a small gesture, but after 2 years of Victor's cruelty disguised as affection, the simple honesty of it undid her slightly. "Mr. Rossi wanted to ensure you'd be comfortable," Marco said quietly. "If you need anything changed, furniture, colors, anything, you just let me know." "It's perfect," Elena managed. "Thank you." After Marco left, Elena unpacked in silence, hanging her modest wardrobe in a walk-in closet that could have housed 50 people's clothing, setting her books on shelves that begged to be filled, trying to make sense of how her life had transformed in less than 24 hours. She was placing her mother's locket on the dresser when she heard the penthouse door open.
Elena.
Dante's voice carried through the space. She found him in the main living area, still in a charcoal suit but with his tie loosened and his jacket gone, looking exhausted in a way that made him seem more human and somehow more dangerous. When he saw her, something in his expression eased. "You came," he said, and she heard genuine relief beneath the words. "I said I would. People say a lot of things." He moved to the bar, poured 2 fingers of whiskey, then glanced at her. "Do you drink?" Tonight, yes. He poured a second glass, handed it to her, and they stood in the waning afternoon light streaming through those massive windows, two strangers who just agreed to share their lives in an elaborate deception. We should establish ground rules, Dante said finally. Things we both need to make this work. Elena nodded, grateful for the structure. You first. Privacy. We each need space where the other doesn't intrude without permission. My study is off limits. That's where I conduct business you're better off not knowing about. Your bedroom is your sanctuary. The rest of the space we share. Public appearances, Elena added. You'll give me advance notice when we need to be on. And we coordinate the story so we don't contradict each other. Communication about threats, Dante continued. If Victor contacts you, you tell me immediately. If you see anything that concerns you, anyone watching you, anything, I need to know. The same applies to you, Elena said firmly. If there's danger, I deserve to know. No keeping me in the dark, for my protection. Dante's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but close. Fair. What else? Honesty, Elena said. I meant what I said last night. If you can't tell me something, say so. But don't lie. I don't lie, Dante said simply. It's one of the few principles I've kept. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the agreement settling between them. Then Elena's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and felt her blood run cold. Unknown number. I saw you with him last night. What game are you playing? Elena, we need to talk. Her hands started shaking before she could stop them. Dante noticed immediately, crossed the space between them in 2 strides, and took the phone from her trembling fingers. She watched his expression turn to stone as he read the message. Block the number, he said, his voice carrying an edge that could cut glass. He'll just use another one. He always does. Then we'll block those 2. Dante's eyes met hers, and she saw genuine anger there. Not at her, but for her. He doesn't get to contact you anymore. That's not negotiable. You can't control him. Watch me. Dante pulled out his own phone, typed something quickly, and within seconds, it rang. He answered with cold efficiency. Marco. I need full security on Elena Vance. Anyone tries to contact her, approach her, follow her. I want to know about it before they take their next breath. He paused, listening. Yes, immediately. When he hung up, Elena was staring at him with an expression caught between gratitude and fear. You can't just... Victor isn't some random stalker. He's connected. He has resources. Not like mine, Dante said flatly. And he just made his first mistake. Letting me know he's watching you. That gives me legal grounds to take action. He handed back her phone. From now on, you don't face him alone. You understand. Elena wanted to argue, wanted to insist she could handle it. But the truth was she'd been handling it alone for 2 years, and it had nearly destroyed her. So instead, she just nodded, and something in Dante's expression softened fractionally. Are you hungry? He asked. The subject changed so abrupt it took her a moment to process. Yes, actually. Good. I was going to order dinner, but if you want to cook, he gestured toward the kitchen. Everything's stocked. And just like that, the tension broke slightly. They moved into the enormous chef's kitchen, and Elena found herself falling into the familiar rhythm of cooking. Something real and normal in a situation that felt increasingly surreal. Dante helped without being asked, moving around her with surprising grace for someone so large, and by the time pasta was ready, the apartment felt almost comfortable. Over dinner, they worked out the logistics of their cover story. They'd met at the gala when Maria introduced them, had dinner the next night, and the connection was immediate. They'd keep it vague enough to avoid contradictions, but detailed enough to feel authentic. Elena would continue her restoration work from the penthouse's spare room that Dante had already converted into a studio with north light and proper equipment. Another gesture that surprised her with its thoughtfulness. We have an event tomorrow night, Dante said as they finished eating. Christie's auction house. It'll be our first major public appearance as a couple. Elena's stomach twisted with nerves and something else. Anticipation, maybe, or the dark satisfaction of knowing Victor would hear about it within hours. If you're wondering whether Elena can really pull off this dangerous deception, stay with me, because what happens at Christie's is only the beginning. The Christie's event was everything Elena remembered from her previous life and nothing like it at the same time. The auction house glittered with old money and new wealth, art dealers and collectors moving through the pre-showing with champagne glasses and calculated interest. But this time, Elena wasn't invisible. This time, she arrived on Dante Rossi's arm, wearing a designer emerald dress he'd had delivered that morning with a note that simply said, "This will make your eyes impossible to ignore," and every head in the room turned when they entered. Dante introduced her to people she'd only dreamed of meeting. Museum curators, private collectors, the kind of connections that could resurrect a dead career overnight. And the strangest part was that he didn't introduce her as his girlfriend first. He introduced her as Elena Vance, authentication specialist, and let them see her expertise before they saw the relationship. When they paused in front of a disputed Raphael sketch, Elena couldn't help herself. Years of training took over and she analyzed the brushwork, the paper composition, the stylistic markers that suggested either a genuine master or a very talented forger. When she finished her assessment, she looked up to find Dante watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. "You're captivating when you talk about your work," he said quietly. "You know that." Before Elena could respond, she felt the temperature in the room drop several degrees. She turned and saw him, Victor Kane, standing 10 feet away with his blonde date. His blue eyes locked on Elena with an intensity that made her skin crawl. He approached with false confidence, extending his hand to Dante as if they were colleagues. "Victor Kane, I don't believe we've been properly introduced." Dante took his hand, and Elena saw Victor wince slightly at the pressure of Dante's grip. "Dante Rossi. And yes, Elena's mentioned you." "Has she?" Victor's smile didn't reach his eyes. He turned to Elena and she saw the calculation there, the assessment of how to regain control. "Elena, we should talk, privately, about that matter we discussed." "There's nothing to discuss," Elena said, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "Everything was settled. The debt is being handled," Dante interjected smoothly, his hands sliding to Elena's waist in a gesture of possession that was unmistakable. "By my attorneys. And I suspect they'll find some interesting discrepancies in your documentation." Victor's mask slipped just enough to show the rage beneath. "You have no right." "I have every right," Dante said, his voice dropping to something cold and dangerous. "Elena is under my protection now. And if you contact her again, if you so much as look at her wrong, we'll have a very different conversation. Do you understand me?" The threat hung in the air between them, and Elena watched Victor do the calculation, saw him weigh his options and recognized that Dante Rossi was a fight he couldn't win. He stepped back, nodded stiffly, and disappeared into the crowd with his date trailing behind him. Elena realized she was shaking, not from fear, but from the exhilaration of watching someone finally stand up to Victor on her behalf. "Breathe," Dante murmured, his thumb rubbing small circles against her back in a gesture that felt far too intimate for their arrangement. "Thank you," she managed, "for that." You don't need to thank me," Dante said. "He had no right to speak to you that way." In the car afterward, Elena couldn't stop replaying the encounter, couldn't stop seeing Victor's face when he realized he'd lost control. "Your lawyers," she said quietly. "When they review the debt documents, what if he's telling the truth? What if I really do owe him?" Dante turned to her, and something in his expression made her heart skip. "I attended one of your lectures at Columbia 3 years ago. Authentication methods for Quattrocento panel paintings. You were brilliant. The entire room was mesmerized. I bought your research paper, still have it, actually." Elena's world tilted. "You were there. Front row," Dante confirmed. "And when my mother told me about this arrangement, about you, I knew exactly who you were. I've known what Victor Kane did, how he stole your work and destroyed your credibility." His jaw tightened. "I've wanted to destroy him for that since the day I read about it. My mother giving me an excuse to do it was just convenient." "Why?"
Elena bratted.
"Why would you care about some random academic?" Because brilliance shouldn't be punished, Dante said simply. And because men like Victor Kane need to learn there are consequences. He paused, studying her face. The debt is fake, Elena. I had my investigators check before I agreed to this. He's been using falsified documents to control you for 2 years. The words hit Elena like a physical blow. 2 years. 2 years of believing she owed him, of restricting her life and her choices and her sense of self-worth because of a lie he'd constructed so carefully she'd never thought to question it. The rage that rose in her throat was so sudden and overwhelming she couldn't speak. Dante seemed to understand. He pulled the car over, turned to face her fully, and waited while she processed the truth that was reshaping her entire understanding of the past 2 years. He gaslit me, she finally whispered. The whole time, every bill collector that called, every threatening letter, was orchestrated by him, Dante confirmed. My lawyers have the documentation. By next week, you'll have legal proof that you owe him nothing and never did. Elena closed her eyes, and for the first time in 2 years, she let herself feel the full weight of what Victor had done. And beneath that weight, something else began to take root. Not just anger, but determination. If the debt was a lie, then everything else he'd made her believe might be a lie too. Her inadequacy, her responsibility for the relationship's failure, her unworthiness of respect or protection. I want him to pay, she said, opening her eyes to find Dante watching her with an intensity that stole her breath. Not just financially. I want him to understand what it feels like to be stripped of everything. Dante's smile was sharp and cold. Then let's make sure he does. Over the next 3 weeks, Elena settled into a routine with Dante that felt increasingly less like an arrangement and more like something dangerously real. They had coffee together every morning at 7, silent but comfortable, reading news on their tablets while the sun rose over Central Park. Elena worked in her studio during the day, restoring pieces that Dante's connections sent her way, and he'd come home in the evenings looking exhausted but would always ask about her progress with genuine interest. They attended events twice a week, gallery openings, charity dinners, the opera, and each time, Elena felt herself reclaiming space she'd ceded to fear. She spoke with authority about art authentication, networked with curators who suddenly remembered her groundbreaking Columbia research, and stood at Dante's side as an equal partner rather than an accessory. But Victor's harassment escalated. Texts came from new numbers daily. You're making a mistake with Rossi. He's dangerous. I can help you if you just talk to me. You think he cares about you? You're a novelty. I know where you are. I can reach you anytime. Elena blocked each one, but the invasion of her peace felt relentless. Until one afternoon when everything changed. She was working in her studio, analyzing a 14th century panel painting for a private collector, when she heard voices from Dante's study, raised voices, sharp with anger. Elena knew the rules. The study was off-limits. But curiosity and concern drove her down the hallway, and when she reached the door that had been left slightly ajar, she stopped breathing. Through the gap, she could see Dante with his shirt sleeves rolled up, standing over a man tied to a chair whose face was swollen and bloody. Marco stood beside them, expression cold and efficient, and Dante was asking questions in that controlled voice of his that somehow made the violence worse because it was so calm. The shipment that went missing from the warehouse, Dante said. Where did it go? The man spat blood. Go to hell, Rossi. Dante simply nodded to Marco, who struck the man across the face with brutal precision. Elena gasped, couldn't stop the sound from escaping, and Dante's head snapped toward the door. Their eyes met through the gap, his dark and unreadable, hers wide with shock, and she saw the exact moment he registered what she'd witnessed. She ran back to her room, locking the door, heart hammering against her ribs while her mind tried to reconcile the man who brought her coffee every morning with the man who could order violence without flinching. She'd known intellectually what Dante was, what his family did, but seeing it made it real in a way that terrified her. The knock on her door came 10 minutes later.
Elena.
Dante's voice was rough. Open the door, please. She didn't move, couldn't move. I know you're scared, he continued, something raw edging into his tone. I know what you saw. But I need you to let me explain. You were torturing him, Elena said through the wood. I was interrogating someone who tried to poison one of our family restaurants, Dante corrected. Someone who could have killed innocent people, children, families, for money. Pause. I'm not asking you to approve. I'm asking you to understand. Elena's hand hovered over the lock. Every instinct screamed at her to stay safe behind the barrier, but something in his voice, the honesty, maybe, or the lack of manipulation, made her open the door. Dante stood there still in his blood-stained shirt sleeves, looking exhausted and vulnerable in a way she'd never seen. This is who I am, he said quietly. What I do to protect people I'm responsible for. I won't apologize for it because those methods keep my family, my employees, everyone under my protection alive in a world that would devour them otherwise. His jaw tightened. But I am sorry you had to see it. Sorry you had to be reminded of the darkness you've agreed to live beside. Elena studied him, really looked at him, trying to see past the surface to the complicated truth beneath. Tell me why, she said. Tell me the story that made you into this. Something flickered across Dante's features. Surprise, maybe, that she wasn't running. You want the monster's origin story? I want to understand the man I'm living with. So Dante told her. They went to the rooftop garden he maintained as a private sanctuary, sat on a stone bench overlooking the city lights, and he unraveled the history that had shaped him. His father, killed by the Calvetti family when Dante was 17. His mother Isabella, an artist who tried to escape the violence, murdered when Dante was 19 in a hit made to look like a robbery. Coming home to find her in her studio, paintbrush still clutched in her hand, blood pooling across canvases she'd never finish. I became what I needed to become to survive, Dante said, his voice carefully controlled. Cold, calculating, willing to do things that would have horrified my mother. He turned to Elena. The arranged marriage to Gianna Calvetti is meant to heal the family rift, but I can never forgive them for my mother. I can never be what they want me to be, compliant and controllable and willing to pretend the past didn't happen. Elena reached out, took his hand, and felt him startle at the contact. I understand, she said quietly. Do you? His eyes searched hers. Or are you just being kind? I understand what it's like to have someone steal your future, Elena said. Victor stole mine. My career, my reputation, my sense of self. You're right that the methods are different, but the survival instinct is the same. We both became what we needed to become to keep going. Dante looked at their joined hands. This stopped being fake for me, he said, the admission quiet but seismic. I don't know exactly when, but somewhere between the coffee and the art discussions and watching you reclaim your brilliance, I stopped performing. Elena's breath caught. Dante, I know, he said quickly. It's not part of the deal. I'm not asking you to feel the same way. I just needed you to know that what I feel is real, even if the arrangement isn't. It stopped being fake for me too, Elena admitted, the words tumbling out before she could second-guess them. And that terrifies me because the last time I trusted a powerful man with my heart, he destroyed me. I'm not Victor Kane, Dante said, and there was steel beneath the gentleness. I'll never be Victor Kane. They sat in silence after that, hands clasped. The city spread below them like a blanket of lights, both knowing they'd crossed a line that would change everything and unable to step back even if they wanted to. The shift between them after that night was subtle but undeniable. Dante started coming home earlier, joining Elena in her studio to watch her work with a fascination that felt intimate. She started sleeping with her bedroom door unlocked, knowing he was on the other side of the connecting door and feeling safe rather than trapped. They cooked together, argued about art authentication methods and Italian films, fell into a rhythm that felt like partnership rather than performance. And then one morning, Dante handed Elena a leather portfolio across the breakfast table. I had my investigators track down the original documentation, he said quietly. Your research, everything Victor published under his name. Elena opened the portfolio with shaking hands and found it all there. Her original notes, her methodology, her breakthrough analysis that had taken her 2 years to develop. all bearing Victor's name in the published version but her handwriting and signature in the originals. Proof of the theft that had destroyed her career. "How did you?" she breathed. "I have resources," Dante said simply, "and I wanted you to have it back. What you do with it is your choice, but you deserve to know the truth was never lost. Just hidden." Elena looked up at him. This complicated man who could order violence without blinking but had spent weeks tracking down stolen academic research just to give her closure, and felt something in her chest crack wide open. "Thank you," she whispered. "This means... I can't even explain what this means." "You don't have to," Dante said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "I see you, Elena. I've seen you from the beginning, and I'll keep making sure the rest of the world sees you too." But that same afternoon, everything began to unravel. Elena received a call from her former colleague at Columbia. Victor had held a press conference announcing a major authentication discovery involving the Moretti collection, a private holding of Renaissance works owned by the Rossi family. He was questioning their provenance, suggesting they might be forgeries or stolen pieces, and calling for a full investigation. It was a calculated strike designed to destabilize Dante's family while simultaneously attacking Elena's judgment by association. If the Moretti collection was compromised, anyone connected to it would be tainted, including the restoration specialist who'd been publicly dating Dante Rossi for the past month. "He's trying to destroy both of us with one move," Elena said, watching the press conference on Dante's office screen while her stomach twisted into knots. "If those pieces are questioned, your family's reputation can weather it," Dante said, but she heard the tension beneath the calm. "We've weathered worse." "But what if he's right?" Elena asked, the thought hitting her like ice water. "What if there are pieces in your collection that shouldn't be there? What if I've been authenticating works for a family whose holdings include—" "Then we find out the truth," Dante interrupted firmly, taking her shoulders and turning her to face him. "Together. Elena, look at me. Whatever Victor has uncovered or manufactured, we handle it. But I need you to trust that I wouldn't have brought you into this if I thought you'd be authenticating forgeries or stolen art." But the seed of doubt had been planted, and that night, when Elena couldn't sleep, she did something stupid. She left the penthouse alone, telling herself she just needed air, just needed to walk and clear her head. She made it 3 blocks before she realized someone was following her. If you're holding your breath right now, hit that like button and keep watching, because what's about to happen will change everything. She ducked into an all-night diner, pulled out her phone with shaking hands, but before she could call Dante, a familiar figure slid into the booth across from her. Victor Kane smiled like a predator who'd finally cornered his prey.
"Hello, Elena."
"I think it's time we had that talk." Elena's blood turned to ice. She started to stand, to run, but Victor's hand shot across the table and gripped her wrist with bruising force. "Sit down," he said quietly, the veneer of charm completely gone. "We both know you came out here hoping I'd find you. You want answers about the debt? About the Moretti collection? Sit down and I'll tell you everything." She should have run, should have screamed, should have called Dante the second she felt the prickle of awareness that someone was following her. But 2 years of Victor's manipulation had trained her to respond to his control, and her body obeyed before her mind could override the impulse. She sat. "That's better," Victor said, releasing her wrist but keeping his eyes locked on hers with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "You want to know the truth about the debt? You're right to be suspicious. The documents were creatively constructed. But you signed them, Elena. You just don't remember because I made sure you were appropriately distracted at the time." The casual admission of what amounted to fraud sent rage burning through her veins. "You forged my signature." "I had your signature," Victor corrected, "from dozens of legitimate documents. Not my fault if some of them ended up on paperwork you never actually read." He leaned back, supremely confident. "But here's what your Mafia boyfriend doesn't know. Those documents? They're the least of your problems now." "What are you talking about?" "The Moretti collection," Victor said, and his smile turned cruel. 6 pieces in Dante Rossi's family holdings are stolen Renaissance works that went missing from Italian museums during World War II. I have documentation proving it, Nazi confiscation records, shipping manifests, the whole paper trail. And you, darling Elena, have been publicly authenticating works for the family that's been hiding them for 70 years. Elena felt the floor drop out from under her. That's not possible. It's very possible, Victor interrupted. And when I release this information, which I will unless you do exactly what I tell you, your career won't just be destroyed again. You'll be criminally complicit in art trafficking. Federal charges. Elena. Prison time. Why? The word came out broken. Why are you doing this? Victor's expression twisted into something ugly. Because you were supposed to be mine. I built you, gave you opportunities, shaped your career into something that mattered. And instead of being grateful, instead of recognizing that you owed me everything, you threw it away. And then you had the audacity to replace me with Dante Rossi within a month?
No.
He leaned forward. You don't get to move on while I'm still deciding whether you're useful. The predatory gleam in his eyes made Elena's stomach turn. This wasn't about love or even possession. This was about control for its own sake, about punishing her for daring to exist outside his manipulation. What do you want? She asked, though she dreaded the answer. Come with me, Victor said. Right now. There are people who want to meet you, who have questions about your boyfriend's family business. You answer their questions, you cooperate with their investigation, and maybe, I'll consider not destroying what's left of your pathetic career. Every alarm bell in Elena's head was screaming. This wasn't a negotiation, this was a trap. But if what Victor said about the Moretti collection was true, if she'd been unknowingly authenticating stolen art, then she needed to know. Needed to understand what she'd gotten herself into with Dante. 1 hour, she heard herself say. I'll listen to what these people have to say. Then I'm leaving and you never contact me again. Victor's smile was triumphant. See? You're being reasonable. Just like old times. He stood, offered his hand. My car's outside. Elena should have called Dante. Should have told someone where she was going. Should have done 1,000 things differently. But the doubt Victor had planted about the Moretti collection, the fear that she'd been used as a pawn in a game she didn't understand, again, made her follow him into the night. The car wasn't Victor's. It was a black SUV with tinted windows and a driver Elena didn't recognize. Warning bells became sirens, but before she could turn back, strong hands grabbed her from behind. A cloth pressed over her mouth and nose, and chemical sweetness filled her lungs as the world went dark. When Elena woke, she was in a warehouse that smelled of rust and river water, tied to a chair with her head pounding and her mouth tasting like copper. Dim light filtered through broken windows high above, and the sound of water lapping against pilings told her she was somewhere near the docks. Ah, Miss Vance is awake. The voice came from the shadows, cultured, Italian-accented, familiar from somewhere. A man stepped into the light, silver-haired and distinguished, and Elena recognized him with a jolt of terror. Lorenzo Calvetti, the man from the gala, the one Dante had been so carefully deceiving all month. Where? Elena's voice came out rough. What do you want? Information, Lorenzo said pleasantly, as if they were having tea instead of him holding her captive. About Dante Rossi's business operations, his security protocols, his family's vulnerabilities. You've been living with him for weeks, sleeping in his home. You must have seen things, heard things that would be useful to me. I don't know anything, Elena said, her mind racing through possibilities. The relationship is fake. It was an arrangement to block your marriage proposal. Oh, I know it started as an arrangement, Lorenzo interrupted. Victor was kind enough to share that detail before we decided his services were no longer required. He nodded to someone behind Elena, and she heard a pained groan. Turning her head as far as the ropes allowed, she saw Victor slumped in another chair, his face battered and bloody, barely conscious. Horror and grim satisfaction warred in Elena's chest. Victor had played both sides and lost to both. But what started as arrangement has become something else, hasn't it? Lorenzo continued. I've watched you together. The way Rossi looks at you isn't performance, which makes you valuable, both as information source and as leverage. He pulled out a phone, held it up so Elena could see Dante's contact information on the screen. Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to call your boyfriend and explain that his cooperation is the only thing standing between you and a very unpleasant end. He's going to agree to my terms, marriage to my daughter, merging of our family operations, full surrender of his independence. And you're going to help convince him. He won't do it, Elena said, even as her heart hammered with fear. He'll come for me, but he won't surrender his family. Then I'll kill you in front of him, Lorenzo said simply. And then I'll kill him. And then I'll dismantle everything his father built until the Rossi name is nothing but a cautionary tale. He smiled. I've been patient for 30 years, Miss Vance. I can be patient for a few hours more while we wait for him to arrive. Elena tested the ropes around her wrists, felt them bite into her skin, and knew she couldn't break free through force. But Dante had spent weeks teaching her things without her fully realizing it. How to read a room where exits were, how to assess threats. And more importantly, he'd taught her that she wasn't helpless, that survival sometimes meant fighting even when the odds were impossible. Time became elastic. Elena couldn't tell if minutes or hours passed while Lorenzo's men moved through the warehouse making preparations, talking in low voices about when Rossi arrives and the ambush point. She cataloged every detail, the number of men, 6 that she could see, the weapons they carried, guns mostly, one with a knife, the distance to the door, 30 feet, but she'd never make it tied up, the structure of the warehouse, old, unstable, full of shadows and places to hide. And she thought about Dante, about coffee mornings and late-night conversations, about the way he'd looked at her on the rooftop when he admitted his feelings were real, about the life they could have if they survived this nightmare. The warehouse door exploded inward with a boom that made Elena's ears ring. Dante came through the smoke and splinters like an avenging angel wrapped in darkness, Marco and 4 other men flanking him with weapons drawn, and the calculated coldness on his face was the most terrifying and beautiful thing Elena had ever seen. Lorenzo's men opened fire. Dante's team returned it with brutal efficiency. Elena threw herself sideways in the chair, rolling behind a concrete pylon as bullets tore through the space where she'd been sitting, her heart slamming against her ribs while the sounds of violence echoed through the warehouse. Then Dante was there, cutting her ropes with a knife, his hands checking her for injuries with a gentleness that contrasted violently with the chaos around them. "Are you hurt?" His voice was raw with emotion she'd never heard from him.
I'm okay, Elena gasped.
"Victor set me up. The Calvettis." "I know," Dante said. "Marco tracked your phone." "Elena, what the hell were you thinking leaving alone?" "The Moretti collection," she interrupted urgently. "Victor said there are stolen pieces, Nazi confiscation, that I've been authenticating." Dante's expression went carefully blank. "We'll talk about it. Later. Right now." He pulled her behind him as another round of gunfire erupted. "Stay down. This ends tonight. If your heart is pounding right now, don't go anywhere. The truth about the Moretti collection is about to come out, and it's more complicated than anyone expected." What followed was the most terrifying 10 minutes of Elena's life. She watched Dante and his men systematically dismantle Lorenzo's operation with a precision that spoke to years of training and ruthlessness she'd never fully appreciated. Lorenzo himself tried to escape through a back entrance, but Marco intercepted him. And suddenly the man who'd threatened her was on his knees with a gun to his head. And in the corner, Victor Kane was crying. Actually crying, begging for mercy from Dante, from Lorenzo, from anyone who would listen. "I can give you information," he sobbed. "About the art fraud operation, about the Calvetti money laundering, I can—" "You can shut up," Dante said coldly, not even looking at him. He crossed to where Elena stood on shaking legs and cupped her face with both hands, searching her eyes with an intensity that made her knees weak for entirely different reasons. "Did he hurt you?"
No, Elena whispered. I'm okay.
"But Dante, what he said about the collection is partly true," Dante admitted, and Elena felt her heart crack. "And I need you to hear the whole story before you decide whether you can forgive me." Sirens wailed in the distance. Marco had already called the police. This operation had been coordinated with law enforcement, Elena realized, because half of Lorenzo's men were being arrested on trafficking charges that had nothing to do with tonight's abduction. Victor was babbling confessions about art fraud and money laundering to anyone who would listen, and Lorenzo Calvetti was being read his rights while his empire crumbled around him. But Elena only had eyes for Dante, who looked at her like he was memorizing her face before she disappeared. "The penthouse," he said quietly. "Come home with me. Let me explain everything. And then you can decide." The drive back was silent, tension thick enough to choke on. Marco drove while Dante sat in the back with Elena, his hand holding hers like he was afraid she'd vanish if he let go. When they finally reached the penthouse, dawn was breaking over Central Park, painting everything in shades of gold and rose that felt obscene given the night they'd survived. Maria Rossi was waiting in the living room, immaculate as always but with worry etched around her eyes. She stood when they entered, opened her mouth to speak, but Dante held up a hand. "Mother, sit down. It's time." Elena knew everything. They gathered in the living room as sunlight streamed through the windows, and Maria began to speak. 6 pieces in the Moretti collection were acquired by Dante's grandfather during World War II. He purchased them from a German officer who claimed they were his family heirlooms being sold for passage to South America. Dante's grandfather believed the story, or chose to believe it. After the war, when the truth about Nazi looting became clear, he hid the piece's true provenance rather than face the shame of having profited from stolen art. "So Victor was telling the truth," Elena said, feeling nauseous. "I've been authenticating stolen works. You've been authenticating legitimate Renaissance pieces," Dante interrupted. "The art itself is real, but yes, the provenance is compromised. And you deserve to know I've known for 5 years." He met her eyes steadily. "I've been working with international authorities to identify the rightful owner's descendants and plan restitution. But the process is complex, legal, political, emotional. Some of these pieces have been missing for 80 years. Maria leaned forward. "I chose you specifically because Victor was investigating the collection as part of his Calvetti operation. I needed someone inside his confidence, someone who could help us understand what he knew and how dangerous it was. The arrangement with Dante wasn't just about blocking the Calvetti marriage. It was about getting close enough to Victor to protect ourselves from his blackmail." The words hit Elena like physical blows. "You used me," she said, her voice hollow. "Again. This whole time I was just bait, a tool, something to manipulate." "No," Dante said urgently, kneeling in front of her chair. "Elena, look at me. Started that way, I won't lie to you. My mother's plan was strategic. But what happened between us, what I feel for you, that was never part of any plan. You have to believe me." "Why should I?" Elena asked, and heard her voice break. "How do I know any of it was real? The coffee, the conversations, the way you looked at me when you thought I wasn't watching. How do I know it wasn't all just very convincing performance?" Dante's expression cracked, showing the vulnerability beneath. "Because I've never been good at performance. Ask anyone who knows me. I can't fake emotion. Everything you saw was real. Every moment I fell deeper despite knowing I had no right to, despite knowing that when you learned the truth you'd look at me exactly the way you're looking at me now." His hands framed her face gently. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking you to let me prove that what we have is worth fighting for." Elena closed her eyes, tears finally spilling over. "I don't know if I can trust my own judgment anymore. Victor manipulated me for years. Your mother manipulated me for months. How do I know you're any different?" "Because I'm giving you a choice," Dante said. "Right now, the arrangement is over. The Calvettis are finished. Lorenzo will be in prison for the rest of his life. Victor is facing federal charges that will keep him locked up for decades. The threats that brought us together are gone." He released her face, stood up, put physical distance between them. "You can leave, right now. I'll still make sure the debt documentation is legally voided. I'll still provide references to restore your career. Everything I promised you'll get. But you don't owe me anything. Not 4 months. Not another day, nothing. And if I stay?
Elena whispered.
Then it's not because of any arrangement or any deal, Dante said. It's because you choose to, because you believe what we have is real enough to survive the truth about how it started. Maria stood quietly. I'll give you privacy to decide.
Elena.
I'm sorry. I thought I was protecting my son. I didn't consider deeply enough what I was asking of you. She left through the terrace door, closing it gently behind her. Elena sat in the sunlit living room, looking at Dante across 10 feet of hardwood floor that felt like an ocean. Everything she'd feared had come true. She'd been used, manipulated, positioned as a pawn in a game she didn't understand. But the difference between Victor and Dante was that Dante was giving her the truth, messy and painful as it was, and offering her real agency to decide what came next. The Moretti collection, she said finally. What happens to it? Full restitution, Dante said without hesitation. I've already drafted the plan with international authorities. The pieces will be returned to the descendants of their original owners or to the museums they were stolen from. It'll cost the family millions in lost value, and our reputation will take a hit. But it's the right thing to do. You're willing to do that? Elena asked. To dismantle part of your family legacy? I'm willing to do what's right, Dante corrected. My grandfather made choices I can't defend. I won't let those choices continue to define who we are. He paused. And I won't ask you to be associated with a family that profits from stolen art. If you choose to stay, it'll be knowing we're fixing this. Together. Elena stood, walked to the window, looked out at the park she'd grown to love over the past weeks. She thought about Victor's manipulation, the lies wrapped in affection, the control disguised as care. And she thought about Dante's, the strategic arrangement that had become something real despite neither of them planning it. The difference was that Victor had never given her the option to leave, had never admitted the truth, had never offered her the choice to love him knowing exactly who he was. Dante had given her all of that. She turned back to face him. I'm angry, she said, at your mother for using me, at you for keeping secrets, at myself for walking into this without asking harder questions. You have every right. I'm not finished, Elena interrupted.
I'm angry.
But I also understand survival. I understand doing complicated things for good reasons. And I understand that what happened between us, the real parts, the parts that weren't arrangement, those matter more than how we started. She took a breath. I'm choosing to stay, not because of money or career restoration or any deal. I'm staying because I fell in love with you somewhere between the coffee and the art discussions and watching you try to be better than the world expects you to be. Dante crossed the space between them in 3 strides, pulled her into his arms, and kissed her like she was air and he'd been drowning. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he pressed his forehead to hers. I don't deserve you, he whispered. Probably not, Elena agreed. But we're both going to spend the rest of our lives trying to deserve each other. Deal? Deal. The next 6 months were a whirlwind. The restitution of the Moretti collection became international news, with Dante and Elena working together to authenticate pieces and trace them to their rightful owners. The process was complex and painful. Some descendants wanted nothing to do with art that carried such traumatic history, while others wept with gratitude at having family treasures returned. Elena's role in the restitution project restored her reputation in ways that no amount of networking could have achieved. She was interviewed by art journals, invited to consult on museum exhibitions, offered teaching positions at 3 universities. And through it all, Dante stood beside her, not as the powerful man who'd rescued her, but as her partner who let her brilliance shine without trying to control or claim it. Victor Kane's trial was brief. The evidence against him, art fraud, money laundering, conspiracy with the Calvettis, the forged debt documents, was overwhelming. Elena attended every day of proceedings, sitting in the gallery and watching the man who'd terrorized her for 2 years be systematically dismantled by justice. On the final day, when the judge asked if anyone wanted to deliver a victim impact statement before sentencing, Elena stood. She walked to the front of the courtroom on steady legs, looked at Victor directly, and spoke the words she'd spent years being too afraid to say. You tried to make me believe I was nothing, she said, her voice clear and unwavering. That without you, I had no value, no voice, no right to exist in the spaces I'd earned through my own work. You stole my research, destroyed my career, and spent 2 years convincing me that I owed you for the privilege of being controlled. She paused. But you were wrong. I am brilliant. My work matters. And the only thing I owe you is this truth. You have no power over me anymore. You never will again. If you've been waiting to see Elena reclaim her voice, this is that moment. Hit that like button if justice feels good. Victor looked away, unable to meet her eyes, and Elena felt the final chains of his control shatter and fall. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in federal prison for art fraud, conspiracy, and extortion. As he was led away in handcuffs, Elena didn't feel triumphant. She felt free. That night, Dante took her back to the Metropolitan Museum. They walked through the galleries where their story had begun, past the spot where Maria had first whispered her proposition, past the auction preview where they'd first appeared as a couple, until they reached the Renaissance wing that held Elena's favorite pieces. I have something for you, Dante said, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. And before you see it, I need you to know this isn't obligation or arrangement or anything except the simple truth that I want to spend the rest of my life with you. He opened the box to reveal a sapphire ring, deep blue as the dress she'd worn that first night at the gala, set in platinum with a design that was elegant and understated, and so perfectly Elena that her eyes filled with tears. Elena Vance, Dante said, dropping to one knee in front of a 15th century Madonna. Will you marry me? Not because of any deal or any debt or anything except that I love you and I choose you and I want to build something real with you that doesn't have an expiration date. Yes, Elena said, laughing through tears. Yes, you ridiculous man, of course yes. He slid the ring onto her finger, stood, and kissed her while museum security pretended not to watch. And Elena thought about how far she'd come from the invisible woman hiding at a gala, thought about the price of freedom and the weight of choice and the beautiful complexity of loving someone who'd started as strategy and become something far more profound. They married 6 months later in a small ceremony at the Metropolitan Museum, surrounded by close friends and family, and enough art to satisfy both their souls. Maria cried, actual tears, not strategic manipulation, and told Elena she'd never seen her son so at peace. Marco served as best man and gave a toast about how Dante had been insufferable before Elena and was only marginally less insufferable now, which made everyone laugh. Elena wore sapphire blue, and Dante couldn't take his eyes off her through the entire ceremony. At the reception, while they danced to something slow and Italian that Dante had chosen, Elena looked up at her husband and smiled. I have something to tell you. Should I be worried? Dante asked, but he was smiling too. The Uffizi Gallery in Florence offered me a position, Elena said. Head of their authentication and restoration department. It's my dream job, Dante. The kind of opportunity one thought I'd lost forever. She watched him process this, the implication that she'd be in Italy, that their life would change shape again, that she was choosing her career with the same weight she'd chosen him. For a moment she worried he'd ask her to refuse, to stay in New York, to put his needs above her ambition. Instead, he pulled her closer and said, Then I guess I'm learning to run the family business from Florence. When do we leave? Elena's love for this complicated, dangerous, surprisingly gentle man overflowed. You'd really move? Leave New York? Elena, Dante said seriously. I'd move to the moon if that's where your dreams took you. You don't shrink yourself for me. Ever. That's the deal. Best deal I ever made, Elena said, and kissed him while their family and friends cheered. They moved to Florence in the spring. Elena threw herself into her work at the Uffizi with the passion of someone who'd been starved and was finally allowed to feast. She published papers, mentored young conservators, became known throughout Europe for her expertise and her integrity. And every evening, she came home to an apartment overlooking the Arno where Dante would be waiting with wine and terrible attempts at cooking pasta that made her laugh until she cried. Sometimes Elena thought about that night at the gala, about the moment Maria had whispered her proposition and Elena had said yes despite every instinct screaming danger. She thought about how terror and possibility had felt identical in that moment, and how the choice to step into the unknown had led to reclaiming everything she'd lost and discovering things she hadn't known she needed. She thought about Victor sometimes too, not with anger anymore, but with the distant acknowledgement of a storm survived. He'd tried to make her invisible, and instead, he'd inadvertently pushed her toward becoming unforgettable. But mostly, Elena thought about the mornings, about waking up beside Dante as sunlight streamed through their Florentine windows, about coffee shared in comfortable silence, about the way he looked at her like she was the most important work of art in any collection. She'd spent years believing she was nobody. Victor had reinforced that belief with systematic cruelty. But Dante had seen her brilliance even when she couldn't see it herself, had given her the space and support to remember who she'd been before fear made her small. And now, standing in the Uffizi surrounded by Renaissance masterpieces while her husband surprised her with lunch, watching tourists photograph works she'd helped restore, Elena Vance, now Elena Rossi, finally understood the truth Victor had tried so hard to bury. She'd never been invisible. She'd just been surrounded by people too threatened by her light to let it shine. But those days were over, and the future stretched ahead, bright and boundless and hers. Thank you so much for watching and listening to Elena and Dante's story. Their journey from a desperate deal to real love shows us that sometimes the best things in life come from the bravest choices, and that we're never too broken to rebuild something beautiful. If the story touched you, moved you, or made you believe in second chances, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Until next time, keep believing that your story isn't over. Sometimes it's just beginning in ways you never expected.